Hello everyone, welcome back to AMH 2010, U.S. Introductory Survey to 1877. In our last video, we discussed the War of 1812 and the changes the American nation faced in the years after this conflict, during the so-called Era of Good Feelings. In this video, we will discuss Jacksonian America, and how Americans of all classes responded to the rapid and seemingly unprecedented technological and social changes their country was experiencing from the 1820s through the 1840s. We will begin by discussing Andrew Jackson. Andrew Jackson has been identified by many historians as the archetypical American of the 1820s through the 1840s. Jackson was a product of the time in which he lived, but he in turn shaped his contemporary world through his words and actions, both good and bad. He truly was what one historian called the symbol for an age. Indeed, American politicians of the Jacksonian era, Jackson, Henry Clay, William Henry Harrison, and James K. Polk, were symbols of the period, and they represented the values of everyday Americans. In order to understand Jacksonian America, we have to consider the period's political leaders, as they represented a cross-section of American society, at least of white American society. We will start with Andrew Jackson. Andrew Jackson was born in 1767 in the Waxhaws, a part of the Appalachian Mountains sitting astride the borders of present-day Carolinas and Tennessee. These days, Tennessee claims Jackson as its own, because he lived most of his adult life within the volunteer state's borders. Like most of the white people living in the Appalachians, Jackson's ethnic heritage was Scotch-Irish. Specifically, Jackson's ancestors were Scots who colonized Northern Ireland, Ulster, before they ultimately sailed to the U.S. in the mid-1700s. Jackson never knew his father, who died in a logging accident about a month before he was born. Without a male breadwinner, Jackson's family was very poor, almost destitute, and young Jackson received a very minimal formal education as a result. During the Revolutionary War, Andrew Jackson served as a courier for the local Patriot militia, being that he was only 13 years old in 1780 when the fighting in South Carolina intensified, as you will remember from our previous discussions of the Revolutionary War. Jackson and his neighbors hated the British and the Loyalists, and were motivated to become patriots as a result of the massacre of Patriot POWs after the Battle of the Waxhaws, which we also discussed in a previous video. The British invaded the region and even quartered in young Jackson's cabin. A British officer ordered Andrew to polish his boots. Young Jackson haughtily refused, so the British officer slashed him across the forehead with his sword, leaving a scar that Jackson would carry with him for the rest of his life. After the war, Jackson, who had an impatient and combative personality, struggled to keep a job. He worked in a variety of professions, but finally took up the study of law. Being on poor terms with his family, Jackson moved to Nashville, now in Tennessee. In Nashville, he met and married Rachel Donaldson, who had been divorced. Andrew and Rachel had a marriage ceremony and even lived together before her divorce was finalized, creating legal troubles and scandal for the young couple, although frontiersmen were less bothered by this relationship than people on the settled East Coast. After his marriage, Jackson would work as a land speculator, claiming parcels of land and selling them using his legal knowledge. Jackson became fairly wealthy and bought a plantation and slaves at the Hermitage in Gallatin, Tennessee. In some ways, Jackson was considered a better slave master than other contemporary slaveholders, as he allowed his enslaved people a greater deal of personal autonomy and provided them with better quarters, food, and even parcels of money. In other ways, Jackson was a far worse master than his contemporaries, as he put profit first and incentivized overseers to whip slaves who did not work hard enough. Jackson also served as a congressman for Tennessee after it became a state in 1796. Because of his poor upbringing and his controversial marriage, as well as his ethnic background, Jackson was a man preoccupied with his sense of honor. If he felt his or his wife's reputation had been slighted by an adversary, he would challenge the offender to a duel. It is said that Jackson fought over 100 duels in his lifetime, although he killed only one man during these fights. Jackson himself was wounded multiple times, however, and carried bullets in his body, which caused him great pain and sickness in his later years. Dueling was technically illegal in most of the United States, and killing a man in a duel could further damage one's reputation, as seen by Aaron Burr's killing of Alexander Hamilton in a duel in 1804. To Jackson, however, dueling seemed the best way to secure his honor, in spite of the risks. When the U.S. declared war against Great Britain in 1812, Jackson enthusiastically went to war, gathering over 2,500 Tennessee militiamen to fight on behalf of the U.S. I will not go into too much detail about Jackson's role in the War of 1812, because we discussed it in a previous video. I will say that Jackson welcomed war with Great Britain, because he wanted the United States to expand westward. At this point in his life, Jackson was a Jeffersonian Democratic Republican who believed that the nation's future prosperity should be secured through land acquisition, even if it came at the expense of Native Americans or other European powers, namely Spain. As congressman, Jackson had advocated for white settlers' land interests over those of Native Americans, and he had financially supported the disgraced Aaron Burr's attempted filibustering of Texas in 1805, then controlled by the Spanish. Jackson, like many other Democratic Republicans, recognized the War of 1812 presented the ideal opportunity to expand the United States' territorial holdings. After the War of 1812, Jackson saw additional military service during the First Seminole War, a conflict which began during the War of 1812 in 1814, but it really did not end until 1819 with the U.S. purchase of Florida. Florida was, at the time, part of Spain's empire. A Native American group called the Seminole people, consisting of exiles and refugees from a variety of tribes, as well as escaped slaves, lived on the border between the U.S. and Spanish territory. The Seminole would lead raiding parties into South Georgia, attacking white American settlements and encouraging black slaves to join their ranks. The Seminoles kept black slaves themselves, but tended to treat their enslaved people better than white Americans did. Spain had African slavery in many of its colonies, but it had a long tradition of welcoming escaped slaves from Georgia into their colony, giving them freedom if they converted to Catholicism and agreed to serve in their colonial military. In some cases, the Spanish even gave black enslaved people to the former Georgian slaves that served in their armed forces. Spanish Florida refused to stop Seminole/African American raids, and even tacitly encouraged them. Because of these raids, and the continued escape of Georgian slaves, President James Monroe ordered Jackson to invade Florida in 1818. Jackson had some experience in Florida, having pursued retreating British agents into the state back in 1814. Jackson's army crossed the border and clashed with the Seminoles and the Spanish. Jackson's force consisted of militia, regulars, Creek Indians, and angry settlers who wanted revenge on the Seminole. Jackson's army burned Seminole and Miccosukee settlements in northern Florida, forcing these people to retreat southward down the peninsula. Jackson's army also attacked the Spanish and basically expelled them from the territory. Jackson's seizure of northern Florida during the First Seminole War forced Spain to sell the territory to the U.S., as seen in the Adams-Onis Treaty of 1819. The U.S. government settled the Seminole on a reservation in north-central Florida at the Treaty of Moultrie Creek in 1823. This would be important later. Jackson's service in the War of 1812 and in the First Seminole War made him a national hero. Americans who liked Jackson hoped he would run for president, while his enemies worried that he might use his military fame to become a dictator. As we discussed previously, the Panic of 1819 and the banks and the Monroe administration's responsibility for this economic crisis convinced Jackson to return to politics. Jackson briefly served as a senator for Tennessee, but he ran for president in 1824. Jackson was still a part of the Democratic-Republican Party, the only political party that the country had at the time. Within the Democratic-Republican Party, there were several wings. One candidate, John Quincy Adams, Monroe's Secretary of State, and son of former President John Adams, represented the interests of the rapidly industrializing northern states, and of all the candidates, was closest to the values of the now defunct Federalist Party. Another candidate, the young Kentuckian Henry Clay, the Speaker of the House, wanted to connect the East and West using banks and internal improvements like canals, what was called the American system. The third candidate, William Crawford of Georgia, Monroe's Treasury Secretary, was part of a movement called the Tertium Quids, Latin for third something. Crawford represented the interests of Eastern plantation owners and advocated for a more genteel, hierarchical system. Jackson himself ran on a pro-westward expansion policy, and of all the candidates was probably the closest to Thomas Jefferson's original agrarian vision of the Democratic-Republican Party. At this point in American history, presidential candidates did not campaign for themselves in the way that they do today. Instead, they remained at home or in their occupations and let volunteer supporters and surrogates run their campaigns and draw up support through stump speeches. It was considered rude for a candidate to campaign for himself, and a degradation of American politics. Even the bombastic and aggressive Jackson mostly adhered to these conventions in the 1824 election. In the election, Jackson gained a plurality of the popular vote and carried most of the western and frontier states, although he interestingly took Pennsylvania, New Jersey, Delaware, and Maryland. Crawford did fairly well in the coastal southeast, taking his home state of Georgia as well as the large state of Virginia. Adams won New England and New York. Clay took his home state of Kentucky, but also Ohio and Missouri. Because Jackson had failed to win the majority in the popular vote, Adams and Clay made a deal with each other. Clay agreed to award his electoral college delegates to Adams, giving Adams enough delegates to win the election. In exchange, Adams made Clay his Secretary of State. Adams and Clay both mistrusted Jackson. They worried that he was a populist demagogue who would undermine the American political system and change the United States from a constitutional republic into a direct democracy. Jackson resented losing the election, calling the agreement between Clay and Adams the corrupt bargain. The corrupt bargain between Adams and Clay only strengthened Jackson's political convictions and would inspire him to run again for the presidency in 1828. As president, Adams continued many of James Monroe's policies, but he also brought in elements of Clay's American system, calling for increased investment in internal improvements and the military. Adams also de-emphasized the United States' westward expansion, instead believing that the nation should focus on connecting its cities and hinterlands before it tried to expand further. Adams still wanted to see the nation expand westward, and he wanted Native Americans to either assimilate to Anglo-American culture or give up their land, although his Indian policy was less aggressive than that of Jackson. Southerners also worried that Adams of Massachusetts was secretly an abolitionist. Adams was anti-slavery, but his abolitionist leanings would not be confirmed until after his presidency, during his career as a congressman. Adams believed that the increased government spending that the American system required should be paid for with additional tariffs, which angered many of his political allies and all of the mercantile voters of New England, his base. Jackson once again ran for president in 1828. In this election, Jackson took a more active approach in his campaign, giving speeches himself and commenting on the policies of the Adams administration, which he condemned as being corrupt. Jackson declared that his new political movement, the Democratic Party, was committed to the ideals of Jeffersonian virtue and democracy. Adams' political movement, called the National Republicans, was hierarchical and elitist, according to Jackson. The 1828 election was far more acrimonious than 1824 had been. The Jacksonian press attacked Adams, declaring him as an out of touch with everyday Americans. Adams' press allies represented Jackson as a dangerous, emotional demagogue, a violent slave owner and Indian murderer, who was fond of duels and had questionable morals because of his marriage to Rachel Donaldson, a divorcee. Rachel actually died in the lead-up to Jackson's inauguration, and Jackson blamed the negative press his wife had received for her death. The Adams press also insulted Jackson's parentage, suggesting his mother was a prostitute and that his father was black. All in all, though, Jackson's campaign was far more effective than Adams's. Jackson won the 1828 election in a landslide, winning 55.5% of the popular vote and 178 electoral votes to Adams' 83. Jackson's modern campaign style, which included stump speeches before potential voters, helped him win the presidency. But Adams' alienation of his allies, including John C. Calhoun, his vice president, also helped Jackson win. Jackson actually made Calhoun his vice president and assembled a cabinet that included some former Adams supporters. As president, Jackson advocated for many democratic, anti-elite, and Jeffersonian policies. Jackson wanted to remove property requirements for voting, and he wanted to extend voting rights to all adult white male American citizens. Jackson also suggested that politicians should have term limits and that even the Electoral College should be eliminated. Historians acknowledge that Jackson himself, while very forward-thinking on some issues, advocated for many regressive policies as well. Jackson's idea of democracy was race-based and extended only to white males. Some historians have even called Jacksonian democracy Herrenfolk, or master race democracy, arguing that Jacksonianism was white supremacist at its roots. Although we might criticize Jacksonian democracy for its racism, contemporaries recognize that Jacksonian democracy was very radical and forward-thinking for the time. Alexis de Tocqueville, a French aristocrat and scholar who traveled across the U.S. in the 1830s, praised Jacksonian democracy, but saw slavery and the mistreatment of African Americans as antithetical to its values. Tocqueville was keenly aware that white Americans treated black people and Indians poorly, but he believed that equality for all white men would inevitably lead to emancipation and liberty for all races, whether white people liked it or not. Andrew Jackson was the first U.S. president to come from a lower-class frontier background. All previous presidents, Washington, Jefferson, Madison, Monroe, and the two Adamses, had come from either Virginia or Massachusetts, and they had been at least middle class, if not wealthy. Jackson was born into poverty, but became wealthy through his land speculation and the labor of his slaves. During his first term, Jackson sparred with the established political elite in Washington, both in terms of policies and in private life as well. Jackson had invited everyday Americans to attend his inauguration party at the White House. The guests made a mess of the presidential mansion and had made a ruckus, angering career-long politicians. The women of Jackson's cabinet, led by Florida Calhoun, hated Margaret Peggy O'Neill Eaton, the wife of Jackson's Secretary of War, John Eaton. Peggy Eaton was a very attractive young woman, both by the standards of the day and our modern sensibilities, and she frequently violated the gender norms of the period that elite white women were expected to follow. Peggy Eaton loved to sing and play piano and dance, and reveled in the attention of men besides her husband. The wives, or petticoats, of the cabinet naturally turned on Eaton and spread rumors that Peggy was of low moral character. Jackson, who was still grieving for his deceased wife, saw the similarities between Peggy's situation and how his deceased wife Rachel had been treated, so he naturally sided with Ms. Eaton against Florida Calhoun and the other cabinet wives. The Eaton affair, as this squabble came to be known, would rip Jackson's cabinet apart and prevent him from completing very much of his agenda during his first term. Jackson's cabinet in the first term was also torn apart over political issues as well. In particular, the tariff divided Jacksonian from his VP, John C. Calhoun. Jackson did not like tariffs, but he had come to see them as a necessary evil. Calhoun, a wealthy planter from South Carolina, saw tariffs as a threat to his way of life, since they made imported European luxury goods more expensive, and could lead Britain and France to putting retaliatory taxes on the cotton he sold from his plantation. Jackson revised his predecessor's 1828 Tariff of Abominations, making it weaker and more favorable to Calhoun, but his efforts were not enough to mollify the angry South Carolinians. The South Carolinian government passed legislation declaring that they could nullify federal laws like tariffs in 1832. Jackson saw the nullification crisis over the tariff as a threat to the American Union, so he dispatched the U.S. Navy to block Charleston Harbor and prepared to invade South Carolina should it try to secede from the Union. In the end, Henry Clay, Jackson's former enemy, helped to negotiate a compromise tariff that satisfied Calhoun and the South Carolinians, preventing civil war, at least temporarily. Events like the nullification crisis and personal squabbles like the Eaton affair got in the way of Jackson's first-term agenda and actually led to him dismissing his entire cabinet. In 1832, Jackson sought re-election to his second term. In 1832, partisan politics was in full swing again in America. Jackson's Democrats ran against the National Republican/Whig Party, which nominated Henry Clay, the senator from Kentucky, as their candidate. The new political organization called the Whigs had emerged as a party that was dedicated to the American system of internal improvements and to fighting Jackson's radical democracy. The National Republicans/Whigs were also pro-bank, while Jackson increased his attacks on banking in his re-election campaign, declaring banks made the rich richer and the powerful more powerful. For Jackson's next VP, the Democrats chose Martin Van Buren of New York, an American of Dutch descent. Van Buren had not grown up in wealth, like Jackson. His father had operated a tavern in Kinderhook, and young Martin grew up speaking Dutch as his first language. Although they both came from modest backgrounds, Van Buren and Jackson were very different men. Jackson was stalwart in his principles to the point of being inflexible. Van Buren, however, liked to make compromises and deals. He was a skilled politician called the Little Magician by his contemporaries. Even their appearances were different. Jackson was tall and thin, had a military bearing, and coarse white hair, which gave him a physically imposing, almost prophetic visage. Van Buren, in contrast, was short, stout, and bald, and had a very unassuming appearance. Jackson was also aggressively pro-slavery, while Van Buren had some anti-slavery leanings. In many ways, Jackson and Van Buren were opposites. Their differences, however, were what made Jackson and Van Buren such a good team. Both men wanted to grow the power and prestige of the Democratic Party. Van Buren sacrificed his political career in the short term, giving up his governorship of New York in 1829 so he could serve as Jackson's Secretary of State. Van Buren also encouraged Jackson to dismiss his entire cabinet, even himself, after the Eaton affair. For his sacrifices, Van Buren was the natural choice for VP during Jackson's second term. During his second term, Jackson made his war on the National Bank his first priority. Jackson blamed the Bank of the United States, BUS, for the Panic of 1819, and he wanted to dissolve it in favor of smaller state banks that would be operated by Democrats. The fight against the bank was difficult, however. Nicholas Biddle, director of the BUS, was not going to go down without a fight, and requested the BUS's charter be renewed in 1832. Congress renewed the charter, but Jackson vetoed it. Although the bank war had technically begun during his first term, Jackson continued the fight during his second term. Many of the nation's most brilliant political minds, like Daniel Webster of Massachusetts, attacked Jackson's veto as an abuse of power and extolled the utilities of a national bank. The closing of the national bank and the depositing of its funds into smaller financial institutions called pet banks caused an economic boom in 1834 and 1835 and allowed Jackson to pay off the national debt during his second term. In 1835, Jackson also survived an assassination attempt, the first known assassination attempt on a U.S. president. The would-be assassin, Richard Lawrence, was an unemployed house painter from England who had been unable to take advantage of the ongoing economic boom and blamed Jackson for his financial struggles. Lawrence also had a series of mental problems, and he believed he was English King Richard III reincarnated, leading him to be institutionalized rather than imprisoned for his assassination attempt. During his second term, Jackson continued his policy of the removal of Native Americans from their homelands east of the Mississippi River. During his first term, Jackson had signed the Indian Removal Act of 1830, first passed by Congress. The Indian Removal Act allowed the states to forcibly deport Native American nations from within their borders. Many of these tribes, including the Chickasaw, Cherokee, Creek, Choctaw, and Seminole, had made agreements with the U.S. government, which had made them basically independent nations within the United States, with their own laws and customs. Some of these tribes lived much like white Americans, operating plantations and even owning black slaves. Others, like the Seminole, previously discussed, have rejected Euro-American life ways. Now I want to provide some background on Indian removal, or the forced relocation of Native Americans from their ancestral lands in the eastern U.S. To west of the Mississippi River. We would consider this kind of forced relocation of people from their ancestral lands and homes to be a form of ethnic cleansing. Ethnic cleansing takes place when certain ethnic groups are removed from their homes and forced to live somewhere else. That way another ethnic group can occupy the lands they once lived on. Although terms like ethnic cleansing can be a bit controversial, and I'll explain why later in this slide. The Native American tribes living in the Southeast generally did not permit unrestricted white settlement in their territory. They did allow some white people to live in their nations, but they had to join the tribe, submit to tribal laws, and they had to be there at the invitation of the tribal government and tribal people. For example, white people like Sam Worcester of Georgia were invited into the Cherokee Nation territory at the behest of the Cherokee Nation. White squatters, however, settling in Native American lands would not be so welcome. And this causes a problem or friction between state governments and these Native American nations. The state governments want this land for white settlement for a variety of reasons. In what is now Mississippi, they want Native American lands for the expansion of plantation agriculture and the slave labor that comes with it. In Georgia, for example, northern Georgia is much more mountainous. Plantation agriculture is not as profitable of a thing there. We think that gold may have been a factor. White settlers had found gold in northern Georgia in the late 1820s, and they may have wanted to settle there and have the gold for themselves, even though this gold is in Cherokee territory. And the states had been petitioning the federal government to extinguish Native American land titles within their states for many years, since about 1802, actually. But in 1830, Andrew Jackson, as president, will sign the Indian Removal Act. And this will take away Native Americans' land rights in the East in exchange for reservations in what is now Oklahoma. There are provisions that will allow some Native Americans to stay behind in their ancestral territories, but they will not have tribal protection. They will not be living under tribal laws. They will be living as U.S. citizens and residents of the various states, be it Georgia or Mississippi, for example. And most Native Americans, because of differences between their cultures and white American cultures, they found that deal to be unacceptable. Also, they experienced a lot of violence and racism from white people, and so the prospect of living without tribal protection would not have been appealing to the Native Americans living in the eastern U.S., especially in places like the Southeast. I should add, though, that the Native Americans of the Southeast, even though they had their own indigenous traditions, they had adopted many elements of white American or Euro-American lifeways, particularly plantation agriculture and enslavement of African peoples. So even though there are some differences between these Native American cultures and white American cultures, there's also some big similarities as well, which in many ways makes it all the worse that white Americans in these states wanted to force Native Americans off of their land. And in all, about 60,000 Native Americans are going to be removed from the East by the Indian Removal Act over the course of about 10 years or so. They come from about 18 different tribes or nations. Some Native American tribes will go more quickly, like the Choctaw, for example, that will leave in 1831 and 1832. Other tribes will fight using American legal systems. Most notably are the Cherokee, who will use the U.S. Supreme Court to try to stay in their homes in Georgia. They'll be able to stay until about 1838, so a little bit longer than some other tribes, but ultimately they will not be successful. Still others, like the Sacs and the Foxes of the Midwest, up here, they will resist the United States and white settlers militarily, and there will be a brief military conflict called the Black Hawk War, in which the Sac and the Fox will fight against white settlers. It's actually in the Black Hawk War that a young Abraham Lincoln has his brief taste of military service. Lincoln served in the Illinois militia. The most notable military resistance by Native Americans to the Indian Removal Act is the Second Seminole War, fought by the Seminole people from 1835 to 1842 down in Florida. White Americans wanted to remove the Seminole from Florida, one, so they could occupy the Seminole lands and spread plantation agriculture to those parts of Florida. Also, the Seminole often allowed African American escaped slaves to live amongst them, and so the Seminole presence in Florida often enticed slaves to escape from their plantations in places like Georgia and Alabama and parts of Florida that had been settled by white people. And also, in the past, the Seminole had gone on raids on white plantations and white settlements in the past, and a lot of white settlers worried that the Seminole might do that as well. So the Seminole are a military threat, in addition to being, you might say, economic impediment. They're occupying and living on lands that white people want for themselves. And the policy of forced Indian removal will intensify during Jackson's second term. In his second term, he doesn't have to worry about being reelected. Indian removal was very controversial, not only to Native Americans, but to many white Americans as well. And it will also continue during the presidency of Martin Van Buren. In fact, the most famous removal of Native Americans, the Cherokee Trail of Tears, takes place in 1838, not during the presidency of Jackson, but during the presidency of Van Buren. By the way, the actual migrations of Native Americans are often referred to as trails of tears in general, but the Cherokee Trail of Tears is probably the most famous. And as I mentioned before, some Native Americans will remain in the East, but they will not be living on tribal lands, and they will not have tribal protection either. The Cherokee Nation, through its legal battles, was able to delay its expulsion from Georgia until 1838, during Martin Van Buren's presidency. The Cherokee, and other nations before them, were forced to make arduous journeys across the Southeast, with minimal food and supplies, all while under the guard of U.S. and state troops. These painful journeys, called Trails of Tears, led to thousands of Native Americans dying en route to their reservations in what is now Oklahoma. It is worth noting that not all Native Americans left the Southeast at this time. Some Native Americans stayed in the Southeast, living among white people without tribal protection. Now I want to discuss the timeline for the Cherokee Nation's fight to remain in Georgia. And I also want to discuss the state's attitudes towards white settlement on Native American lands in a bit more detail. Generally, the states wanted to take control of Native American territories within their borders. They had been pressuring the government to extinguish Native American land titles within their borders for about 30 years before 1830. At the same time, though, these states realized that if white settlers were moving into Native American territories and violence broke out between the white settlers and the Native Americans who were legally residing there, there could be problems and the federal government could come in, and that would complicate things for the states that wanted to take these lands and take control of them. It's for reasons like that that the state of Georgia will pass certain laws preventing white settlers from settling in Native American territory, in Cherokee territory, without a license from the state of Georgia. This license granted by the state of Georgia was not granted for the benefit of Native Americans. Rather, it was to keep too many white settlers from moving into Cherokee territory, causing friction between the Cherokee and the white settlers, and the U.S. government coming in between the Cherokee and the state of Georgia. So with that additional background and clarification in mind, we'll discuss this timeline of events. In 1830, the Indian Removal Act is passed. Ultimately, the Indian Removal Act of 1830 will lead to the forced removal of about 60,000 Native Americans from about 18 tribes or nations in the eastern U.S. In 1831, there's the Cherokee Nation versus Georgia case. In this case, the Cherokee Nation, in this Cherokee Nation v. Georgia case, the Cherokee Nation is petitioning the Supreme Court for an injunction against Georgia laws that are a threat to Cherokee national sovereignty. And the Supreme Court basically declines to rule in the Cherokee Nation v. Georgia case because it's decided that the Cherokee Nation is what is called a domestic dependent nation, a nation within the boundaries, entirely within the boundaries of the United States, that it is not a foreign nation, and therefore it cannot rule in this case. So this case really has mixed results for the Cherokee. On the one hand, it defines that they are not just part of the state of Georgia and subject to Georgia law. But on the other hand, the U.S. Supreme Court is not really upholding Cherokee rights as a sovereign nation. It says they are a domestic dependent nation. In 1832, there's the Worcester versus Georgia, Worcester v. Georgia case. Sam Worcester was a white missionary living in Cherokee territory. He was there on the invitation of the Cherokee. He did not have a license from the state of Georgia, so he was a white man breaking Georgia's law about living in Cherokee territory. And remember, this law is not passed to help or benefit the Cherokee. It's passed to keep the federal government from interfering with Georgia's relations with the Cherokee. And Worcester is tried and put in prison in Georgia, and he appeals his case. And the Supreme Court declares that his imprisonment is invalid because it goes against the laws of the Cherokee Nation, which had permitted Worcester to live in their territory. It was said that Andrew Jackson, President Jackson, was not pleased with the Worcester v. Georgia case. It said that he referenced the Supreme Court Justice John Marshall, and he told a confidant, let them enforce it. Let them enforce this law. What basically happened was Worcester remained in prison. It was not released for another year. Not until 1833 was he released from his imprisonment. In 1835, there's the Treaty of New Echota. New Echota was the capital of the Cherokee Nation in the 1830s. And the Treaty of New Echota was signed between the U.S. government and a minority faction within Cherokee politics and society. This minority faction was called the Treaty Party, and they were in favor of signing a treaty with the U.S. government for removal out west. Their reasoning was that the U.S. Would give them money and land out west, and it was better to leave the eastern United States where they were not wanted and have more freedom and more opportunities in the West, where there were fewer white settlers. There would not be as many white settlers trying to encroach on their territory. The majority of the Cherokee, though, called the National Party, still wanted to stay in Georgia, and they opposed the Treaty of New Echota. And the leader of the National Party was Chief John Ross, who we talked about previously. Ross and the National Party will continue to fight to remain in Georgia for the next couple of years. Some Cherokee are beginning to leave and go to the Indian Territory in what is now Oklahoma. These are, of course, members of the Treaty Party. The National Party under Ross will stick around, fighting to remain in Georgia for a couple more years. But in the winter of 1838, the U.S. government under President Martin Van Buren finally steps in and sends the U.S. military under Winfield Scott, along with state troops, to remove the Cherokee by force. And that takes place in the winter of 1838. And at this point, between 13,000 and 16,000 Cherokee and about 1,500 or so African slaves are removed from the Cherokee territory in Georgia. Remember, many of the Cherokee had adopted Euro-American life ways. They owned plantations. In the region, they owned slaves, and they took their enslaved people with them. And it's estimated that about 4,000 people, 4,000 Cherokee, and then an unknown number of African slaves will die on the way to the Indian Territory. This is a journey that's being undertaken in the winter. It was an unusually cold winter. There was lots of ice and snow. Also, they dealt with starvation, not enough supplies being given to them, issued to them, exposure from the cold. Attacks were made on the Cherokee parties by whites as they moved westward. And this event has been called the Trail of Tears, or in the Cherokee language, it's called the Trail Where They Cried. And about 1,000 Cherokee will remain in the southeast. These were Cherokee people that were living on private land, not tribal land. Cherokee living on private land were allowed to remain where they were living. Um, those that were on tribal land were forced to leave, and a small number also had evaded or escaped U.S. troops that were trying to capture them. So if you go to northern Georgia or southwestern North Carolina, you still will meet Cherokee people living there, but they're not living there in Cherokee tribal territory. And um, zooming back out to consider Indian removal as a whole, Native Americans were removed from the southeast for a variety of reasons, and really from the eastern United States for a variety of reasons. Things like racist ideas about Native Americans, that they could not survive in white American society, that their culture was inferior, that it was going to die out. This is called the myth of the vanishing Indian. This was a very popular idea in the early 1800s, that basically Native Americans would be destroyed if they were not forced to move west to go to the reservations. That's one idea that many people had. Other white people wanted Native American lands. Some of them wanted this land for the expansion of plantation agriculture and slavery. I think this is probably more a factor in the removal of Native Americans in the Mississippi River Valley, like the Choctaw and the Chickasaw. With the Cherokee, they're in northern Georgia, northern Alabama, southern North Carolina, southern Tennessee. This region is not as fit for plantation agriculture. I think gold was probably a bigger factor. There had been gold found in the late 1820s in northern Georgia, and I think white settlers, particularly in Georgia, wanted to find gold in Cherokee territory. So in some cases, slavery is a factor. In other cases, in the case of the Cherokee especially, I think gold was a reason as well. In the case of the Seminole tribe in Florida, uh, the desire to extend plantation agriculture and slavery into Florida is a factor, but also another factor is African American slaves often escaped and fled to Seminole territory. So it's not only about expanding plantation agriculture and slavery, it's about recovering escaped slaves as well. And because the Seminole represented a military threat to people in southern Georgia and southern Alabama, and would occasionally go on raids into southern Georgia and southern Alabama. Others, like the Seminoles, who refused to surrender to the U.S. military, retreated deeper into the depths of the Everglades in South Florida, where the descendants remain to this day. The Seminole War was the United States' longest, bloodiest, and most costly of all wars against Native Americans. It was also very controversial within white American society as well, for a variety of reasons. Jackson and his political allies were harshly criticized for their support of Indian removal, not only by Native Americans, but by white Americans in both the Whig and even Democratic parties. The white critics argued that the removals were illegal, violating treaties that the U.S. had previously made with Native American tribes, or they argued that the removals were immoral because they caused too much death and suffering. On the issue of slavery, Jackson was a major slave owner from Tennessee and supported the interests of the slave-owning South. Jackson was also a strong Unionist, and he believed that abolitionists who called for an end to slavery were a threat to the Union, just like the South Carolina nullifiers had been during his first term. Jackson believed that he was a Unionist first and a slavery advocate second. The South was becoming aggressively more pro-slavery, though. Nat Turner's slave revolt of August 1831 had alarmed white Southern slave owners, leading them to take a harsher stance against both anti-slavery Northerners and black people, both free and enslaved in their own states. Turner's revolt was inspired by a desire for freedom, but also by the increase in African American religiosity during the Second Great Awakening, by the way. In 1835, South Carolina demanded that the U.S. Postal Service ban the mailing of anti-slavery literature, which abolitionists had been circulating in the South. Southerners even destroyed post offices, angered at this assault on the institution of slavery through the postal system. Jackson tried to make a compromise between the abolitionists and the slave power. He refused to ban abolitionist literature from the government mail system, but he did allow Southern postmasters to confiscate any abolitionist tracts they found. In 1836, Anglo-American rebels living in Texas, then a part of Mexico, rebelled against the Mexican government. The Texian rebels revolted for a variety of issues, but one of the reasons was slavery. Mexico had made African slavery illegal after it had gained independence from Spain in 1821. Mexico officially forbade migrating Anglo settlers from bringing their enslaved people to the province, but the nation did little to stop the arrival of American slaves. Americans, especially in the slave-holding South, supported the Texas Revolution, believing that Texas would eventually join the Union as a slave state, giving their section more voting power. Some Northerners supported the Texas Revolution as well, for expansionist and nationalist reasons. But many Northerners condemned the Texan War of Independence, believing that slavery was its cause. Jackson was sympathetic to the Texians, but he waited until after the 1836 election had ended to recognize the Lone Star Republic's independence. He recognized Texas on the last day of his presidency, March 3, 1837. Jackson did not want to risk losing the support of Northern Democrats in the 1836 election. Jackson's gambit worked. Martin Van Buren, the Democratic candidate, Jackson's former VP, won the presidency, beating a crowded field of Whig candidates. On the whole, Jackson was a pro-slavery man who sympathized with the slave policies of the Southern states, even if he did not always like how they advocated for the institution of slavery. Jackson also detested abolitionists. Above all, though, Jackson was a nationalist and a unionist, believing that anyone, pro-slavery or abolitionists, who threatened the Union should be stopped. Ironically, Jackson's attempts to prevent civil war in the 1830s over issues related to slavery, i.e. the nullification crisis, would help to make a war between the northern free states and the southern slave states far more likely in the future. In the end, Andrew Jackson was the archetypical American and symbol for the culture, politics, and values of the early American Republic. Coming from humble beginnings on the frontier, Jackson gained wealth and fame through his military service, land speculation, and slave labor, reaching the U.S. presidency, the highest political office in the land. His life on the frontier, his military service, and his experience as a slave owner impacted his beliefs as a person. In response, Jackson helped to create a new American political faction, the Democratic Party, which represented the values of white frontier Americans like himself. The Democrats took Jefferson's agrarian vision and made it more egalitarian and populistic, at least for white men, leading some people to call Jacksonian democracy Herrenvolk democracy. Considering Jackson's support of Indian removal, his ownership of enslaved Africans, and his sympathies with the Southern slave power, this description has some legitimacy. Andrew Jackson never could have become president if he had not struck a nerve with everyday Americans. Jackson's political ideology and policies were held by hundreds of thousands of Americans, especially in the western frontier states. Americans who had lost their homes and lands in the Panic of 1819 agreed with Jackson that banks were to blame for causing the panic. Americans in the West who wanted land to settle supported Jackson and the Democratic Party, particularly for their policy of Indian removal, which opened up additional land in the Southeast and Mississippi River Valley for white settlement. Americans who supported the Democratic Party were concerned about the rapid changes their nation was facing: industrialization, the growth of banks, the proliferation of wage labor in factories and in infrastructure construction projects. Democrats thought that wage labor was degrading and little better than slavery. Enslaved people, by the way, would have disagreed with their notion that wage labor was barely better than slavery. The Democrats also witnessed technological developments like steamboats and railroads. They saw that the world seemed to be getting smaller, as humans and goods could now travel long distances far more quickly and easily with the aid of these technologies. The telegraph, invented by Samuel F.B. Morse in 1845 to transmit messages electronically, made the spread of information almost instantaneous. It was like the internet of the Jacksonian period, but with fewer technological precedents. People who supported the Democrats saw that society was moving more quickly with each passing year. They longed for a simpler time, when families lived in small, isolated communities, while sustaining themselves on self-sufficient farms. The Jacksonian vision, like the Jeffersonian one before it, held that agrarianism, farmers living independently on their own parcels of land, was the key to making the United States a stable, virtuous nation. Jackson just democratized Jeffersonianism, advocating for agricultural independence and voting rights for all white male citizens. Northern and Southern Jacksonian Democrats remained divided over the issue of slavery. Andrew Jackson and his political ideology also provoked a major backlash amongst his opponents. Jackson's opponents, who founded the Whig Party, recognized the same problems the American nation was facing from the 1810s to the 1840s, but they proposed solutions that were diametrically opposed to those advocated by Jackson and the Democrats. The Whigs, in contrast to the Democrats, believed that bigger banks, more intensive internal improvements, and increased spending on government institutions like the military were the key to making the United States stronger and more stable. According to the Whigs, everyday Americans could experience wealth and prosperity through hard work, trade, and interconnectedness in the increasingly capitalistic American market economy. To the Whigs, growth over time, wealth, and new technology actually brought independence. The Whigs thought wage labor was better than agrarianism, as a farmer was one bad harvest away from destitution, but a wage earner would always be able to find work of some kind. The Whigs were also less enthusiastic about the ideas of Herrenfolk democracy, not because they were anti-racist, but because they feared that tyranny of the majority might take over the government and threaten American political institutions. The Whigs were also less enthusiastic about Indian removal, not because they were pro-Native American, but because they were concerned about the legality of removal, and they thought the nation's attention should be put towards other pursuits. The Whigs were also divided over the issue of slavery, and the Whig Party had many supporters among the planter elite of the Eastern South and among Northern industrialists. Both the Democrats and the Whigs had pro-slavery Southern and anti-slavery Northern wings. In the election of 1836, an anti-slavery Democrat, Martin Van Buren, triumphed over the fledgling and divided Whig Party. Van Buren, the consummate politician, dedicated his presidency to trying to bring peace to American domestic politics. Unlike Jackson, his predecessor, Van Buren believed that Texas should not be annexed by the United States, pleasing the abolitionists but angering pro-slavery interests. In exchange for refusing to annex Texas, Van Buren called for Northerners to tone down their opposition of slavery as a compromise. Van Buren also dealt with a contentious situation on the U.S.'s northern border as well. In 1837, a Canadian independence movement, led by William Lyon Mackenzie, began to flourish in British Canada. The independence movement, styling themselves after the Americans of the Revolutionary War, called themselves patriots. the Canadian Patriots began to recruit Americans in upstate New York and the Great Lakes region to join their independence movement. The Americans who supported the Canadian Patriots called themselves hunters, and they sailed across the Great Lakes aboard ships. The British Navy attacked one such ship, the Caroline, provoking outrage in the United States. Although in this image on the slide, you can see the Caroline is falling over Niagara Falls, so it's not in the Great Lakes. Van Buren mandated that the U.S. must remain neutral and not just stay out of the Patriot War, but arrest, detain, and prosecute Americans that tried to assist the Canadian Patriots, using the U.S. Army as a constabulary on the northern border. Van Buren's plan kept the U.S. from going to war again with Great Britain, as it had done during the War of 1812, and the Patriot Rebellion of 1837 through 1838 failed. Van Buren's diplomacy helped the U.S. avoid a war, but it angered Northern Democrats, who wanted to annex Canada into the United States, just as Southern Democrats hoped to annex Texas. While American expansionists would have been disappointed with the results of the Patriot War and the fact that the U.S. was not able to gain any territory from that conflict, they would have been more pleased with the Aroostook War and the Webster-Ashburton Treaty in the thickly forested woodlands of northern New England and southeastern Canada. Local loggers and militiamen from both the United States and British Canada began to deploy. Both sides wanted these rich timbered forests. The U.S. and the British government had not been able to agree on a border for Maine and for New Brunswick and Quebec, really since the time of the American Revolution. This has been a big problem in the War of 1812 as well. But the issue will be put to rest in the late 1830s and early 1840s during the presidency of Martin Van Buren, and then things are going to be resolved by the presidency of John Tyler in 1842. The primary negotiators for Great Britain and the U.S. were Lord Ashburton of Great Britain and Daniel Webster of the United States. Interesting to note, both sides were searching for maps and documents to back up their respective countries' cases. The British negotiators happened to find more information that backed up the American territorial claims, which you can see on this slide in yellow. And the American negotiators found more evidence that actually backed up the British claim, which had British territory going down all the way to the red and white dotted line that you can see here. In the end, they made a compromise that territorially was more favorable to the United States. The United States gained territory along this green line here, which is the present border of Maine and New Hampshire. So this diplomatic situation was diffused along with the Patriot War. Now we're going to move on to another very contentious diplomatic issue during the Van Buren presidency, and that is the Amistad case. Another important diplomatic event that took place during Van Buren's presidency was the Amistad case of 1839 through 1840. The Amistad was a Spanish slave ship that had illegally transferred slaves from Africa in violation of both U.S. and British anti-slave trade laws, although not the laws of Spain. The slaves aboard the Amistad had taken control of the vessel, and being unable to sail back to Africa, arrived in the United States. The Van Buren administration, not wanting to anger the Spanish government or pro-slavery politicians, supported returning the escaped slaves to Spain. The slaves were defended by John Quincy Adams, a congressman from Massachusetts and a former U.S. president, as well as by abolitionists. In the end, the slaves were freed by the U.S. Supreme Court, since they had been illegally transported to the Americas. The Amistad ex-slaves were allowed to return home to Africa in 1841. The biggest issue that Van Buren faced during his presidency was the economic depression of 1837. A variety of factors, both inside and outside the United States, caused this economic downturn, but Andrew Jackson and the Democrats' anti-bank policies exacerbated the depression in the U.S. The depression continued for 5 years and damaged the reputation of both Van Buren and the Democratic Party. The Whigs attacked Van Buren for his failure to mitigate the effects of the 1837 depression, and even many Democrats refused to help the president because they wanted him to annex Texas, something he had refused to do. To make matters worse, the Second Seminole War continued into Van Buren's presidency. The war, which started in 1835, during Jackson's term, was unpopular, being the United States' longest, bloodiest, and costliest war against Native Americans. The U.S. Army remained underfunded, and the Florida militia, like the militias in previous wars, did not want to fight too far from their home bases. Americans across the country questioned whether the war was even worth it, saying that the swamps of Florida should be left to the Seminoles. The war would not end until 1842, with the removal of most of the Seminole Nation to Oklahoma, although a few Seminoles remained in Florida, hiding out in the Everglades. In 1840, Van Buren ran for re-election, but this time he lost his run for the presidency. As president, Van Buren had tried to be all things to all people, and as a result, he alienated much of his base in the Democratic Party, even as he failed to win over his political opponents. Van Buren also had to deal with the fallout of many of Andrew Jackson's policies, namely his Bank War and Indian Removal Act. The Bank War contributed to the 1837 panic, and the Second Seminole War was caused, at least in part, by Jackson's Indian removal policies. In addition, the Whig Party was far more politically organized in the 1840 election. Once again, the Whigs nominated William Henry Harrison, but this time they took a cue from Andrew Jackson and ran a more intensive campaign. The Whig leadership hyped up Harrison's military experience at the Battle of Tippecanoe and during the War of 1812. They also tried to portray Harrison as a man of the people, who sipped hard cider on the porch of his cabin in Ohio, where he lived at the time. The Whigs were keenly aware that public opinion about alcohol was changing in the late 1830s and early 1840s. Religious, middle-class Americans, who had been a part of the Second Great Awakening, and who tended to live in urban centers in the North, were beginning to turn against alcohol consumption, seeing drunkenness as a sin and an impediment that kept the working class people from being disciplined and advancing themselves economically. Whiskey at the time was the beverage of choice for the average American, but anti-alcohol crusaders wanted to change this. More moderate anti-alcohol campaigners, called temperance advocates, preferred that people drink beverages with a lower alcohol content, like hard cider. More radical alcohol prohibitionists, called teetotalers, wanted all alcohol banned. Alcohol prohibition would not really take off in the United States until after the Civil War. There was also considerable overlap between the religious temperance activists and other reform movements, like the abolitionists and the feminists. Many of these movements had overlapping goals, and they sought to achieve them through similar means, including religion, education, and political activism. Former slaves like Frederick Douglass, William Wells Brown, Sojourner Truth, and white abolitionists like William Lloyd Garrison, the Tappan Brothers, and the Grimke Sisters, along with feminists like Lucretia Mott, Elizabeth Cady Stanton, and Susan B. Anthony, all took part in these reform movements. They often had a variety of overlapping, but sometimes diverging goals. In general, the aforementioned social reformers and their followers tended to vote Whig, if they voted for a major political party at all. Some reformers, like Garrison, by the way, found both the Whig and the Democratic parties to be too pro-slavery, and they supported anti-slavery parties like the Liberty Party. Nonetheless, the image of Harrison sipping cider on his cabin porch resonated with temperance-minded Whigs who hated strong liquor, but also with rural people who liked alcohol and usually voted Democrat. The Whigs also chose John Tyler of Virginia, whose politics were more like that of Democrats than they were of the Whigs, to balance Harrison's Whig policies. Tyler had only joined the Whigs because he thought that Andrew Jackson had abused his power as president. The Whigs also attacked Van Buren as an old, out-of-touch city slicker who did not care about the needs of Americans on the frontier. In a way, the Whigs and their Tippecanoe and Tyler Too campaign were able to beat Van Buren and the Democrats by embracing the imagery of rural Jacksonianism while also reaching people in the more developed Whig parts of the country. By the way, I should add that the Second Great Awakening, while also inspiring new social reform movements, also helped to inspire new religious sects as well. Out of the Second Great Awakening came millenarian groups, like the Millerites, led by William Miller, who believed that the world would end sometime between 1843 and 1844. The term millenarianism references the Christian theological belief in the millennium, which holds that Jesus Christ will return and end the world after a period of time called the millennium comes to an end, or before the millennium comes to an end. It's confusing. Most Christians think that it is impossible to know the exact time that the world will end, but Miller and his followers believed they had calculated the true date of the apocalypse. When Miller's prophecy about the end of the world did not come true, the movement collapsed. One religious movement that came out of the Second Great Awakening but stood the test of time was the Mormon movement. Joseph Smith, the founder of Mormonism, had attended Second Great Awakening revivals in upstate New York, and he believed that God had given him messages and testaments to be added to the Christian Bible. The Mormons gained members to their religion in the 1830s and 1840s, and they were persecuted, particularly for Smith's belief in polygamy, a divisive issue in the 19th century, just as it is a divisive issue today. Smith, who was killed by an angry mob in 1844, led a movement to move the Mormon people out of New York, across the Midwest, and eventually to Utah in 1847, which was then a part of Mexico. Obviously, Smith did not live to see his religion be moved to Utah. By the way, the region of Utah was still a part of Mexico, but the U.S. military by 1847 effectively controlled that part of Mexico. Mormonism was based on the principles of the Second Great Awakening, but it was also influenced by the emerging ideals of manifest destiny and American exceptionalism. Mormons in the 19th century believed the United States was uniquely good and divinely blessed by God. And this idea remains popular with Mormons today. There are many other religious movements besides the Mormons that came to be in Jacksonian America, but that did not last. One such movement was the Oneida community, led by John Noyes, who encouraged communal living and the sharing of all things, even sexual relationships. The Oneida adhered to an extreme form of perfectionism, believing that they could create heaven on earth in their communities. The Oneida established communes across the Northeast, where they sold cutlery and flatware to fund their community. The movement died out in the 1880s because Noyes' son, Theodore, was an agnostic. Other movements that were popular during the 1840s but shrank over time were the Transcendentalists and the Shakers. The Transcendentalist movement developed in New England in response to the rapid industrialization that the region was experiencing at the time. The Transcendentalists, including authors like Henry David Thoreau, Ralph Waldo Emerson, Nathaniel Hawthorne, and Robert W. Longfellow, rebelled against the strictures of traditional Christianity and taught their followers that they could best experience God not by attending church, but by communing with nature. The Transcendentalist movement mostly disappeared in the 1850s, being absorbed into the Unitarian Church. The Transcendentalists were divided over the issue of celibacy, leading many to leave the movement. The Shakers were an offshoot of the Quakers, and they actually started in the 1780s, but they grew in both influence and numbers in the Jacksonian era. The Shakers preached many Jacksonian values, including egalitarianism, although they believed in extending equal rights to women and men of all races. The Shakers performed line dances during their religious services, in which the congregants danced together as equals, although men and women did dance separately, not because women were inferior, but because they believed that members should abstain from sex, and dancing could be a temptation. The Shakers sold very simple but sturdy furniture called Shaker style to fund their communities. The Shakers decreased in number after the Civil War. Charles Dickens, the British author, toured the U.S. in the 1840s and visited a Shaker community in upstate New York. Dickens admired the community for its egalitarianism and economic enterprise, but he joked that its women were so homely that it was no wonder their community practiced celibacy. Now, back to the 1840 election. William Henry Harrison left his cabin in Ohio and went to Washington, D.C. for his inauguration in March of 1841. Harrison took the oath of office on March 4th, a cold and rainy day, and he delivered his inaugural address that was over 2 hours long. Harrison caught a cold from the exposure and died in office a month later. Harrison was the first president to die in office, either of natural causes or assassination. It was not yet determined that the VP would become the commander-in-chief if the president died. To make matters worse, the Whig Party leadership, primarily Daniel Webster and Henry Clay, did not want John Tyler to be president because he was not strong in his Whig principles, particularly the American system. Tyler, antagonizing the Whigs, extolled the values of states' rights in his inaugural address. Consequently, John Tyler found himself attacked by both the Whigs and the Democrats. Tyler joked that he was a president without a party. Because of his lack of political allies, most of Tyler's domestic policies failed, but he was fairly successful on the foreign policy front. During the Tyler presidency, the U.S. increased its naval presence in the Pacific Ocean, challenging Britain and France, and the U.S. sent Caleb Cushing as an ambassador to China, making trade diplomatic overtures to the Middle Kingdom, as seen during the 1844 Treaty of Wanghia, even as the old European empires forced their trade militarily on the Chinese. Taylor also improved relations with Great Britain in the Webster-Ashburton Treaty of 1842, even as he flexed U.S. naval might in the Pacific, particularly around the Hawaiian Islands, then controlled by Britain. Tyler's last and most significant foreign policy move was the annexation of Texas. Tyler tried to annex the Lone Star Republic, something that expansionists and Southern Democrats, along with most white Texans, actually supported. The American electorate, as a whole, was also coming around to the idea of Texan annexation. The problem was, the Whigs were generally against Texan annexation, even the ones who supported slavery. Tyler worried that if the U.S. did not annex Texas, then Britain might try to take control of the Lone Star Republic. Tyler would not sign the Texan annexation bill until his last month of office, in February of 1845. Texas would not officially join the Union until December 29, 1845, 10 months later, during the presidency of James K. Polk. Now I want to talk about the U.S. presidential election of 1844, and I argue that it's one of the most important and impactful presidential elections in American history. Initially, it was expected that former President Martin Van Buren of the Democratic Party would be the Democrats' nominee. Van Buren had been president previously. He had a lot of political experience. He had played a founding role in the Democratic Party, creating the Democratic Party alongside Andrew Jackson. But there were certain issues that will lead to Van Buren losing support amongst the Democrats at the Democratic National Convention. One of those issues is, again, his failures as president, the 1837 panic taking place during his presidency. We've discussed the 1837 panic previously in this video, so I won't go over it again here. Van Buren also had ties, or at least had been associated with the Locofoco faction within the Democratic Party. The Locofocos were a group of working class Democrats from places like New York City that were fighting for workers' rights, among other issues, in the 1830s. And they were seen as being too radical because of how they rioted and protested for workers' rights. And associating Van Buren with the Locofocos made him seem radical to a lot of more moderate Democrat voters. Perhaps the biggest issue, though, was Martin Van Buren's present stance on the annexation of Texas. Van Buren was against the annexation of Texas. He worried that it would lead to a war with Mexico. Mexico still did not recognize the Lone Star Republic's independence, and they would certainly not support the United States annexing Texas either. Additionally, Van Buren did not want to bring more slave territory into the Union. As Van Buren got older, he became more aggressively anti-slavery, which is something we can certainly commend Van Buren for, but it was not a politically expedient thing for his political career in 1844. And it will lead to the Democrats choosing James K. Polk of Tennessee as their nominee, as their candidate for president. And James K. Polk was a protege of Andrew Jackson. He was called the Young Hickory because Andrew Jackson was called the Old Hickory. He was a slave owner from Tennessee, just like Andrew Jackson. And he was relatively unknown politically. He had a political career, but he was not as well known as other Democrats like Van Buren. He was what was called a dark horse candidate for the Democratic Party. And James K. Polk's, basically his campaign promises were expansionist and neo-Jacksonian. He wanted to expand the territorial holdings of the U.S. He promised the reannexation of Texas and the reoccupation of Oregon. Reannexation is a reference to the Louisiana Purchase. Polk claimed that Texas had been bought by the United States during the Louisiana Purchase of 1803. This is a very dubious claim at best. And then reoccupation of the Oregon country is a reference to territory that is now the state of Washington and the state of Oregon, and some territory to the east, as well as territory that's now part of the Canadian province of British Columbia. Polk was claiming that this territory in the Pacific Northwest, encompassing both now U.S. and Canadian territory, that it belonged to the United States. And Polk's supporters, they called for 54-40 or fight. 54-40 is a reference to the southern boundary of Alaska. They were saying that all of the territory all the way to the southern border of Alaska, then controlled by the Russians, should be a part of the United States. It's a very, very large territorial claim. So basically, Polk is a neo-Jacksonian, and he is a very aggressive expansionist. The Whigs will choose as their candidate Henry Clay, a very experienced politician, architect of the Missouri Compromise. He's called the Great Compromiser because of his ability to make deals with his political opponents. Like James K. Polk, he is a slave owner and a plantation owner. He is from Kentucky, whereas Polk is from Tennessee.
On the issue of Texas annexation, Polk, Clay said that he was against annexation for a lot of the same reasons that Van Buren was. But Clay also signaled that he was willing to compromise on annexation, that he might be willing to support it under certain circumstances. Once again, highlighting that he is the great compromiser, and he's willing to compromise in order to further his political career and do what he thinks is best for the American people. There's also the anti-slavery Liberty Party, which will choose James G. Birney of Michigan as their candidate. And the Liberty Party, true to its name, is for liberty. It's against slavery. And we think that the Liberty Party basically siphoned votes away from the Whig Party in the North, particularly in New York. New York was a very close election. Polk very narrowly won the state by only a few thousand votes. And if those votes had gone to, of the Liberty Party had gone to Clay instead of Birney and the Liberty Party, then Clay would have won New York, and he would have then won the election in the Electoral College. He still would have lost the popular vote, but he would have won in the Electoral College. And it's very possible that if Clay had become president, the United States would have developed very differently. Texas most likely still would have been annexed into the United States because the Texas annexation bill is signed by John Tyler, one of his final acts as president before he leaves the presidency. It's possible that Clay would have sought a peaceful solution with Mexico over the Texas annexation. It's also possible that Clay might have not pursued annexation of territory in the Pacific Northwest. He might not have tried to bring the Oregon country into the USA. It's hard to say because obviously Clay does not become president. He never becomes president. Also, the Liberty Party voters, a lot of people will condemn them for voting very idealistically for an anti-slavery candidate when they could have voted for Henry Clay of the Whigs. People argue that even though Clay was a slave owner and the Whig Party was not an anti-slavery party, if you're an anti-slavery voter, it would have been a lot more strategic and pragmatic to have voted for Clay instead of Birney of the Liberty Party, who had no chance of winning. That may be true, but that also assumes the benefit of hindsight. Liberty Party voters had no way of knowing that Polk was going to win the election. They were trying to vote with their hearts, and I don't think we should judge people for doing what they think is right, even if it's not the most politically expedient for their cause. And as I said, the Whig Party is not truly the anti-slavery party. You might at best say that the Whig Party is a little bit less pro-slavery than the Democratic Party, at least at this point in the 1840s.
President James K. Polk's political agenda was very similar to that of his mentor, Andrew Jackson. As a Jacksonian, Polk wanted to expand the United States' territorial holdings to make room for more white settlement. Polk, who promised he would only serve as president for one term, would make territorial expansion his main priority during his brief presidency. Polk recognized a border disagreement between the United States and British Canada in the Pacific Northwest, then called the Oregon Country. The U.S. claimed that the northern boundary in the region was the 54th northern parallel, well into the modern-day province of British Columbia. The British claimed that Canada's southern boundary in the region should be affixed at the 42nd parallel, the current, or contemporary, northern border of Mexico. The British proposal was unacceptable to Americans, as it left the U.S. without any real access to the Pacific coast. The U.S. and the British eventually reached a deal, dividing the Oregon Country at the 49th parallel, the present U.S.-Canadian border. By 1846, Polk had negotiated a satisfactory agreement with the U.S. and Britain, if anything, one that was slightly more favorable to the U.S. Polk wanted to expand the U.S. southern border in the southwest as well. As a southern slave owner, Polk wanted to make sure that the U.S. did not add too many northern free states, negating the electoral power of the southern slave states. This made the annexation of Texas an important issue for Polk, although the negotiations were completed before his inauguration, and he really just signed off on the deal. Polk also wanted to expand further in the North American Southwest and purchase territory from Mexico. Most of the territory that Polk wanted to buy, the Mexican provinces of Nuevo Mexico and Alta California, however, could not become slave states, as more than half of this territory lay north of the Missouri Compromise line. The Missouri Compromise had been a deal that was far more beneficial to the northern free states than it was to the southern slave states. While Polk was a slave owner, and more closely allied with the pro-slavery wing of the Democratic Party, he was a nationalist and an expansionist first. Polk was trying to fulfill the 1840s Anglo-American notion of manifest destiny. Manifest destiny, a term advanced by John O'Sullivan in 1845, mandated that the United States was providentially destined to be the dominant power in North America, ruling the continent from coast to coast. Any power that got in the way of U.S. hegemony, be it Britain, Mexico, or Native Americans, was to be defeated and overcome. Mexico rebutted Polk's land purchase overtures, seeing the American proposition as an insult to its national sovereignty. The United States and Mexico also disagreed on the southern boundary of Texas, whether it lie on the Nueces River or on the Rio Grande, the current Texan-Mexican border. The United States cited the Treaty of Velasco, signed by Mexican Generalissimo Antonio Lopez de Santa Anna, as proof that the Rio Grande was the border. This border would have given Texas and the U.S. a large portion of several other Mexican provinces, some of which already had a significant Anglo-American population, some of which did not. Mexico refused to recognize Texas's independence, much less its annexation by the U.S., although it made it that if Texas was free, its southern boundary must be the same as the old Mexican province of Tejas, which was at the Nueces River, and made Texas a much smaller state. Preparing for hostilities over the Texan border, Polk ordered the U.S. Army, under command of General Zachary Taylor, first to deploy north of the disputed zone, and then to cross the Nueces and enter the contested region. Polk hoped that Mexico would respond by attacking Taylor's forces in the disputed zone, starting a war. Polk got his wish on April 25, 1846, when the Mexican cavalry attacked a detachment of U.S. dragoons. Remember, dragoons is a term for cavalrymen. This attack gave Polk the casus belli he needed to declare war had come by the acts of Mexico herself, and that Mexico had shed blood on American soil. Congress voted to declare war on May 13th. The Democrats generally supported the war, and even many Whigs did as well, although there were some exceptions, like John Quincy Adams, a Whig who thought that Mexican territorial acquisition would lead to more slave states, and Abraham Lincoln, a freshman Whig congressman from Illinois, who initially opposed the war as well. Lincoln argued that Polk had fraudulently provoked armed conflict with Mexico. In August, David Wilmot, an anti-slavery Democratic congressman from Pennsylvania, introduced the Wilmot Proviso, which passed in the House. The Wilmot Proviso declared that any territory the U.S. would take from Mexico during the war would only be permitted to enter the Union as a free state, regardless of whether it fell north or south of the old Missouri Compromise line at the 30th parallel. Wilmot's ambitious anti-slavery bill did not pass in the Senate, and it likely would have been vetoed by President Polk if it did. I will not go into detail here about how the U.S.-Mexican War was fought in this video. I have another video where I go into more detail about how the war was fought and who participated in it, for those who are interested. I will say, though, that the U.S.-Mexican War of May 1846 to February 1848 was a massive victory for the United States. The Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo, which ended the war, gave the U.S. control of the North American Southwest, the land that would become California, Arizona, Nevada, Utah, New Mexico, as well as parts of Texas and Colorado, among other states. Although the U.S. had went to war for democratic aims, it was Whig tactics and strategy that helped the U.S. prevail over Mexico. Mexico initially had a much larger military than the U.S. at the start of the war, but U.S. generals, namely Zachary Taylor and Winfield Scott, both of whom were Whigs, invested in superior technology, particularly artillery and small arms, to defeat the Mexican forces in battle. Taylor and Scott both made use of civil technologies as well, like railroads and steamboats, to move troops out of the U.S. and to deploy them in Mexico. Taylor and Scott both made use of a new generation of officers who had been trained at the U.S. Military Academy of West Point as well. The Whigs supported military academies, but the Jackson Democrats did not, believing such institutions to be expensive and elitist. Some Democrats even proposed closing West Point, although this never actually happened. Thanks to its well-trained officer corps and superior technology, the United States had proven that its regular army could defeat enemies in a foreign war, increasing the U.S.'s international prestige and credibility. American militiamen had served in the Mexican War as well, volunteering for 1 year's service periods instead of the traditional 90 days. President Polk realized early in the war, perhaps remembering the War of 1812, that 90-day enlistments were too short for fighting a war on foreign soil. In general, the volunteers performed well in combat during the Mexican War, although they tended to be less steady in pitched battles than their professional counterparts in the regular army. Where the volunteers faltered, however, was in their lack of discipline in camp and in garrison. Many volunteers robbed, murdered, and sexually assaulted Mexican civilians, often while under the influence of alcohol. Some of these attacks were motivated by racism and ethnocentrism as well, sentiments which were common in Jacksonian America. Officers tried to stop these assaults on Mexican non-combatants, preferring to fight Mexico as if it were an established nation-state, with limited rules of engagement. This limited war strategy stood in stark contrast to the approach the U.S. military had taken against Native Americans, where attacks on Indian non-combatants were a part of the plan. Just as Presidents Andrew Jackson, William Henry Harrison, and James K. Polk were political figures that represented the values of Jacksonian America, the U.S.-Mexican War was fought for Jacksonian values as well, specifically the idea of manifest destiny. The U.S.-Mexican War was a triumph for the United States, but in its victory, the U.S. sowed the seeds for future conflicts, which we will discuss in another video. In the end, the Jacksonian period was a complex, dynamic, and mercurial time in U.S. history. White Americans in particular were concerned about the massive changes their country was experiencing, and they were worried they might be left behind by the nation's rapidly growing and increasingly competitive capitalist market economy. This world created politicians like Andrew Jackson, who were affected by the hopes and fears of their time, while also trying to assuage the worries that everyday Americans had. Jackson was a product of his time, but he also had a tremendous impact on the epoch in which he lived. As U.S. President, Jackson helped to create the Democratic Party, which stood for the values of Herrenvolk democracy, egalitarianism, and voting rights for all white men. To this end, Jackson and the Democrats supported the policies of westward expansion, Indian removal, and dissolution of the National Bank. In response to the Democrats, another political party, the Whigs, developed. The Whigs believed that trade, banks, industrialization, and the investment in technology and infrastructure, funded by banks and tariffs, were key to ensuring American prosperity. The Democrats had victories in 1828, 1832, and the 1836 elections, but they faltered in 1840, primarily due to the Panic of 1837 and the Second Seminole War. Democratic Party's policies were partially to blame for both of these issues. The Whigs got their candidate, William Henry Harrison, a Whig who looked and sounded and acted like a Jacksonian, elected in the 1840 election. Harrison's untimely death a month into office left John Tyler, who was a Democrat in all but name, as president. Tyler's presidency was followed up by the true Democrat, James K. Polk, in 1844, who was a disciple of Andrew Jackson. In this way, the Jacksonians dominated American politics from 1828 to 1848, over 20 years, either as Democrats or, in the case of Harrison, as Whigs. Following the principles of Manifest Destiny, James K. Polk, as president, made Western expansion the priority of his one term as president, leading to the U.S. acquisition of Oregon and the U.S. war against Mexico. The U.S. victorious over Mexico gained the North American Southwest, but unwittingly set itself up for future conflicts over its new territorial acquisitions, which will be the subject of a future video.